As the rain poured relentlessly, a millionaire on his way to the airport noticed a beggar shielding her baby from the storm. In an act of unexpected kindness, he handed her the keys to his house. But when he returned, what he found left him completely stunned. This moving tale of compassion and shocking discoveries will leave you speechless. Alexander Grayson's world was defined by precision, success, and solitude. He was the epitome of a self-made millionaire, polished, relentless, and emotionally guarded. His opulent mansion and pristine luxury cars were symbols of a life he meticulously built from scratch. But behind the grandeur was a man cloaked in loneliness. On a stormy evening, while the rain lashed against his windshield, Alexander found himself driving home from an exhausting board meeting. As the city lights blurred in the downpour, a peculiar sight caught his attention. Under a flickering street lamp stood a young woman cradling a baby. She was drenched, shivering, and clutching a torn cardboard sign that simply read, "Please help." Alexander's foot hesitated on the gas pedal as the light turned green. Years of conditioning told him to keep driving. His life left no room for distractions. Yet the image of the woman, shielding her baby against the relentless rain, clung to him like a thorn. Against his usual instincts, he pulled over and lowered the car window. "Do you need help?" His voice was steady but lacked warmth. The woman looked at him cautiously, clutching her baby closer. Her lips trembled as she tried to form a response. We just need a place to stay for the night." Alexander scanned her fragile frame and the tiny baby wrapped in a soaked blanket. Without another word, he unlocked the passenger door. "Get in." The woman hesitated, her instincts warning her against trusting strangers. But the rain was merciless, and her baby's weak cries drowned out her doubts. Climbing into the car, she whispered a shaky, "Thank you." As the car heater hummed to life, Alexander stole glances at his passengers. The woman's eyes, though weary, held a spark of determination. The baby, no more than a few months old, whimpered softly, its tiny fists clenching against the cold. "What's your name?" Alexander asked, breaking the silence. "Grace," she replied, her voice barely audible. "And this is Lucy." Alexander nodded but didn't press further. As the cityscape blurred past, he found himself wrestling with unfamiliar emotions. His logical mind demanded an explanation for his impulsive act, but something deeper. A long-buried empathy overrode his usual detachment. When they arrived at his sprawling mansion, Grace's eyes widened. The gleaming windows and well-manicured gardens seemed like a mirage compared to the harsh streets she had known. Alexander handed her the keys to the house, a gesture that left her speechless. "You and the baby can stay here for the night," he said matter-of-factly. "I'll sort things out tomorrow." Grace clutched the keys as if they were her lifeline. I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," Alexander replied, already walking toward his car. "Just take care of your child." As the rain continued to pour, Alexander drove off, leaving Grace and Lucy at the doorstep of a sanctuary she never thought she'd find. Grace stood at the threshold of the mansion, her trembling fingers clutching the silver key Alexander had handed her. The grandeur of the house was overwhelming. Massive glass windows framed the warm glow of the lights within, while the sprawling garden seemed untouched by the storm raging outside. For a moment, Grace hesitated. Was this real? A man she didn't know had given her refuge, no questions asked. Her instincts told her to be cautious, but the exhaustion of endless nights on the street overpowered her wariness. Lucy's soft cries snapped her out of her thoughts, and with a deep breath, she unlocked the door and stepped inside. The warmth of the mansion enveloped her immediately. The air smelled faintly of lavender, and the polished floors reflected the soft glow of chandeliers above. Grace clutched Lucy tighter as she walked cautiously through the space. Every corner seemed to whisper of a life so far removed from her own that it felt like stepping into a dream. She found a cozy sitting room with a plush sofa and carefully set Lucy down. The baby, still wrapped in the damp blanket, whimpered as Grace stroked her cheek. "It's okay, Lucy," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We're safe now." But was she? Grace's mind raced with questions. Who was Alexander Grayson and why had he helped her? Wealthy men didn't just stop to help strangers, let alone hand them the keys to their homes. Yet there had been no malice in his eyes, only a guarded kindness that she couldn't fully understand. Her thoughts drifted to the events that had led her here. Just a year ago, she'd had a job, a modest apartment, and hope for a brighter future. But life had a cruel way of pulling the rug out from under you. The father of her child had vanished when she told him she was pregnant. Her job, which barely paid enough to scrape by, had let her go when her pregnancy began to show. And then came the eviction notice. Grace had tried everything to stay afloat. Shelters, odd jobs, even selling what little she had left. But the streets of New York were unforgiving. Lucy's arrival had brought her a fragile kind of joy, but the weight of their circumstances crushed her every day. The nights were the hardest, when she would cradle Lucy in her arms and pray for just one break, one chance to give her daughter a life better than the one they had. And now, here she was, in a house so beautiful it felt like it belonged in a movie. Grace couldn't stop the tears that spilled down her cheeks. For the first time in months, she wasn't bracing against the cold or shielding Lucy from the elements. She allowed herself to sink into the sofa, her body trembling with the release of emotions she'd kept bottled up for too long. After a moment, Grace stood and carried Lucy to a nearby bathroom. The space was immaculate, with gleaming marble floors and a bathtub that looked like it belonged in a five-star hotel. She hesitated before running the warm water, still feeling like an intruder in a world that wasn't hers. As she gently bathed Lucy, Grace marveled at the baby's tiny hands and soft giggles. "You're my little miracle," she whispered, tears mixing with the water. "I'll never stop fighting for you." Once Lucy was clean and wrapped in a soft towel she found in the linen closet, Grace ventured upstairs in search of a place to rest. She discovered a guest bedroom with a bed so inviting it made her knees weak. She laid Lucy down first, brushing a stray curl from the baby's forehead. Lucy yawned, her tiny fists curling as she drifted off to sleep. Grace sat on the edge of the bed, staring out the window at the rain still falling outside. She felt an odd mix of gratitude and unease. This sanctuary was temporary. She couldn't afford to believe it would last. And yet, for the first time in a long while, she dared to hope. As sleep began to claim her, Grace whispered a silent prayer of thanks, not just to God, but to the stranger who had seen her and Lucy as more than just a burden. Little did she know, Alexander's act of kindness would set off a chain of events that would change both their lives forever. Alexander sat in the back of the black town car as it sped toward the airport, but his mind was miles away. The image of Grace clutching her baby, drenched and shivering in the rain, played on a loop in his head. The moment he'd handed her the keys to his home, something in him had shifted, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Alexander Grayson was a man of structure and discipline. Every moment of his life was accounted for, every action deliberate and calculated. He had built his empire from nothing, clawing his way out of poverty to become one of the wealthiest men in New York City. His days were a symphony of power moves and decisive actions, his nights often spent in solitude, his only company the quiet hum of his thoughts. Empathy had no place in his world. At least that's what he had always believed. Helping Grace had been an impulse, one that surprised even him. He had told himself it was a practical decision. She needed shelter and his house had plenty of space. But deep down he knew there was more to it. He leaned his head against the cool window, watching the city blur past. His thoughts wandered to his own childhood, to nights when he had been the one shivering in the cold. His father had been a cruel man, his mother too timid to intervene. Alexander had spent his teenage years on the streets after running away, working odd jobs and sleeping wherever he could. Those years had shaped him, hardening his resolve to never be vulnerable again. Yet here he was, feeling an unfamiliar pang of responsibility for a woman he barely knew. It unsettled him. "Sir, we've arrived," the driver announced, pulling Alexander from his thoughts. The car had stopped in front of a private terminal at the airport. He glanced at his watch. He still had time before the flight. As he stepped onto the tarmac, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the sky remained heavy with gray clouds. Alexander hesitated. His mind tugged back to the mansion where Grace and her child were now settling in. Would she stay? Would she leave without saying a word? He realized he didn't even know her full name. A voice called out from behind him, and he turned to see his assistant, Clara, jogging to catch up. "Mr. Grayson, the board is expecting you in London by morning. I've already coordinated with the hotel staff to ensure everything is prepared." "Thank you, Clara," he said curtly, his tone betraying none of the turmoil within him. He walked toward the jet, each step feeling heavier than the last. Inside the luxurious cabin, he settled into his seat and stared out the window. He tried to focus on the presentation he would be delivering in a few hours, the multi-million-dollar deal that awaited his approval. But no matter how hard he tried, the thought of Grace and her baby lingered. What was it about her that stirred something in him? Was it the way she had shielded her child from the rain with nothing but her own body? Or was it the quiet strength in her eyes, a strength that reminded him of himself in his youth? "Can I get you something, Mr. Grayson?" the flight attendant asked, interrupting his thoughts. "No, thank you," he replied, his voice distant. He reclined his seat and closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, his mind replayed the moment when Grace hesitated before getting into his car, the way she had clutched the key to his house like it was her lifeline. The flight to London was smooth, but Alexander felt anything but. He completed his meetings with the efficiency and precision that had earned him his reputation, but his usual satisfaction was absent. Each night in his luxurious hotel suite, he found himself staring at the ceiling, wondering what was happening back home. By the time he returned to New York 3 days later, he was determined to check on Grace. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was something deeper, though he wasn't ready to name it. The thought of her and Lucy in his home had kept him tethered in a way he hadn't expected. As the car pulled up to his mansion, Alexander noticed the soft glow of lights in the windows. His chest tightened slightly, a mixture of relief and apprehension washing over him. He stepped out of the car and into the foyer, where the faint sound of laughter greeted him. He followed the sound to the living room, where he found Grace sitting on the floor with Lucy. The baby was giggling as Grace dangled a stuffed bear above her, the tension that had etched Grace's face in the rain now replaced with a tentative calm. Alexander stood in the doorway, watching them for a moment before clearing his throat. Grace looked up, startled, her cheeks flushing when she saw him. "You're back," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I am," he replied, stepping into the room. His gaze shifted to Lucy, who was now staring at him with wide, curious eyes. "How are you both?" Grace hesitated, as if unsure how much to share. "We're managing. Thank you again for letting us stay." Alexander nodded, his expression unreadable. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need," he said, the words surprising even himself. "But I'd like to know more about your situation, if you're willing to share." Grace glanced at Lucy, who had started to yawn, her tiny fists rubbing her eyes. She nodded slowly, her shoulders tensing as she prepared to delve into the story she had kept hidden for so long. The room was silent except for the soft crackling of the fireplace. Alexander sat in an armchair across from Grace, his demeanor calm, but his eyes sharp, observant. Grace shifted uncomfortably, holding Lucy close as if the child's presence gave her strength. The weight of his attention was heavy, yet there was something in his gaze, an unspoken gentleness that encouraged her to speak. Grace took a deep breath, her fingers lightly tracing patterns on Lucy's tiny hand. "I don't know where to start," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Wherever you're comfortable," Alexander replied, his tone steady and free of judgment. Grace hesitated, then began. "Lucy's father and I met when I was still in college. He was charming, kind, or so I thought. I didn't realize until later that his kindness came with conditions." She paused, swallowing hard as if the words were difficult to say aloud. "We got married quickly. I thought it was love, but it was more like control. He didn't like me working, didn't like me studying. He said he'd take care of everything. For a while I believed him." Her voice cracked and she looked away, focusing on the fire. "But the truth was, he gambled. A lot. By the time I realized how bad it was, we were in debt. His debt, and I had no way out." Alexander remained silent, letting her continue at her own pace. "When I got pregnant with Lucy, things got worse. He started disappearing for days, sometimes weeks, leaving me with no money and no explanation. I tried to hold everything together for Lucy's sake, but then—" Grace's voice faltered and she bit her lip, fighting back tears. "Then one night he left and never came back." Alexander's jaw tightened imperceptibly, but he said nothing, waiting for her to finish. "I sold everything I could to pay the rent, but it wasn't enough. I lost the apartment. For months we've been moving from shelter to shelter, barely getting by." She looked down at Lucy, her eyes brimming with emotion. "I've tried so hard to keep her safe, but I've failed her. And that night, in the rain..." Grace's voice broke and she wiped a tear from her cheek. "I didn't know what else to do. I didn't think anyone would stop to help." Alexander leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You haven't failed her," he said firmly, his voice carrying an unexpected warmth. You did what you had to do to protect her. That takes strength. Grace looked up, her expression a mix of surprise and gratitude. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence filled with unspoken understanding. Lucy stirred in Grace's arms, letting out a soft whimper. Grace immediately shifted her focus, gently rocking the baby until she settled again. Alexander watched her, his expression softening as he took in the scene. "You've been through more than most people can imagine," he said finally. "And yet, here you are, still fighting for her. That's not failure, Grace. That's resilience." Grace nodded, though her eyes still glistened with unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered. Alexander straightened in his chair, his mind already working through the implications of her story. He had offered her a temporary refuge, but he realized now that this situation required more than just a roof over her head. Grace and Lucy needed stability, a foundation to rebuild their lives. "Grace," he said, his tone thoughtful, "you said you used to work and study. What were you studying?" Her eyes lit up slightly at the question, though her answer was tinged with regret. "Nursing. I wanted to be a nurse." "And do you still want that?" he asked, his gaze steady. Grace hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, but it feels so far away now. I don't even know where to start." Alexander leaned back, a plan forming in his mind. "Let's start here," he said. "You and Lucy are welcome to stay as long as you need. We'll figure out the rest together." Grace stared at him, her eyes widening in disbelief. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "You don't have to," he replied. "Just focus on taking care of Lucy and yourself." For the first time in a long while, Grace allowed herself to hope. She didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, she felt a glimmer of something she thought she had lost forever: trust. The following days in Alexander's mansion were transformative for Grace and Lucy. For the first time in months, Grace woke up without the weight of immediate survival pressing down on her. The soft sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains of the guest room, a stark contrast to the harsh streetlights she had grown accustomed to. Lucy babbled contentedly in her crib, a temporary arrangement Alexander had ordered, delivered within hours of their arrival. Grace stood by the window, gazing out at the sprawling garden. The roses, neatly arranged in vibrant clusters, seemed to symbolize the new beginning she dared not fully hope for. Her reflection stared back at her, a woman who had weathered storms, now standing on the precipice of something unknown yet promising. Margaret, the housekeeper, entered with a tray of breakfast. "Good morning, dear," she greeted warmly. "I brought some oatmeal and fresh fruit for you and little Lucy. How's she doing this morning?" Grace smiled. "She's good, thank you, and thank you for everything. You've been so kind." Margaret waved her off. "Oh, nonsense. This house could use a bit of life. Mr. Grayson might not admit it, but I think he enjoys having company too." Grace tilted her head. "He doesn't seem like the type to take in strangers." Margaret chuckled, setting the tray down. "No, he's not. But there's more to Mr. Grayson than meets the eye. He's carried his own share of burdens, though he'd never talk about them. You and Lucy have touched something in him, I think." Grace pondered Margaret's words as she fed Lucy. She hadn't fully understood why Alexander had stopped that night, or why he continued to offer his help, but she was beginning to sense that his actions were driven by more than mere charity. Meanwhile, Alexander sat in his study, poring over documents with Carter, his trusted lawyer. Carter, a tall man with graying temples, leaned back in his chair, watching Alexander's uncharacteristic focus on Grace and Lucy's situation. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" Carter asked, a hint of amusement in his tone. Alexander looked up, his expression firm. "They need help, Carter, real help. Grace wants to get back on her feet, and I want to make sure she has the means to do it." Carter nodded. "I've already started looking into programs that could help her return to school. But you realize this will require more than financial support. She'll need encouragement, stability, a lot of which you can't exactly provide while running a multinational corporation." Alexander's jaw tightened. "That's why I'm involving you. Help me set up a trust for Lucy, too. I want to ensure her future is secure, no matter what happens." Carter raised an eyebrow. "You're really investing in this?" Alexander leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "It's not about investment. It's something I have to do." Carter didn't press further, sensing that Alexander wasn't ready to articulate what Grace and Lucy had come to mean to him. That evening, Alexander joined Grace and Lucy for dinner, a departure from his usual solitary habits. The dining room, with its long mahogany table and elegant chandelier, felt less imposing with the soft coos of Lucy and Grace's quiet laughter. "You're spoiling us," Grace said, her tone light but appreciative. Alexander smirked. "If you think this is spoiling, wait until Margaret insists on baking her famous apple pie. You won't stand a chance." Grace laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that surprised both of them. For a moment, the tension that often hung between them dissolved, replaced by an easy camaraderie. As Lucy reached for a spoon, Alexander picked it up and handed it to her. The baby giggled, clutching it tightly, and for the first time, he felt the simple joy of connecting with a child. "You're good with her," Grace observed, her voice soft. Alexander glanced at Lucy, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I've never really been around children, but she makes it easy." Grace's gaze lingered on him, a mix of gratitude and curiosity. She was beginning to see the man behind the reserved facade, a man who, despite his wealth and power, carried his own unspoken scars. As the days turned into weeks, Alexander's house began to feel less like a mansion and more like a home. Grace found solace in the routines she was rediscovering, cooking, playing with Lucy in the garden, and even helping Margaret with small tasks around the house. She also began to consider the possibility of returning to her studies, a dream that Alexander subtly encouraged. One afternoon, as Grace sat on the patio watching Lucy toddle around with Margaret, Alexander approached her, holding a folder. "I've been doing some research," he said, handing her the folder. Inside were brochures for nursing programs, along with information about childcare services. Grace's eyes widened. I don't know what to say." "Say you'll consider it," Alexander said simply. "You don't have to decide now, but I want you to know the option is there." Tears welled up in Grace's eyes, and she nodded. "Thank you. For everything." Alexander nodded, his expression soft. "You don't owe me anything, Grace. Just promise me you'll do what's best for you and Lucy." Grace looked down at Lucy, who was now giggling as Margaret blew bubbles for her. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a better future. As the days turned into weeks, the mansion began to feel alive in a way it hadn't for years. Grace, Lucy, and Alexander developed an unspoken rhythm in their interactions. Each morning, Grace and Lucy would have breakfast with Margaret, and often Alexander would join them, setting aside his usual solitary habits. It became clear that Lucy's presence had brought a lightness to the home that Alexander hadn't realized he was missing. One particular morning, as Grace sipped her coffee on the patio, Alexander approached with a rare smile. He held a small stuffed animal in his hand, a soft brown bear with a red bow. "For Lucy," he said, placing it on the table. Grace looked up, surprised by the gesture. "She'll love it, thank you." "It's nothing," Alexander said, but his tone betrayed the significance of the moment. "I just thought, she doesn't have many toys, and I remembered how much my sister loved her teddy bear when we were kids." Grace raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "You have a sister?" Alexander hesitated, then nodded. "Had. Her name was Clara. She passed away a long time ago." Grace's heart softened at the vulnerability in his voice. "I'm sorry," she said gently. "She must have meant a lot to you." "She did," Alexander admitted, his gaze distant. "Clara was the kindest person I knew. She would have been the one to stop for you and Lucy that night. Not me." Grace shook her head. "I don't believe that. You did stop, Alexander. That means something." For a moment, their eyes met, and the weight of unspoken emotions hung in the air. Grace wanted to ask more, but she sensed that Alexander wasn't ready to delve deeper into his past. Later that day, Alexander found himself in his study, reflecting on the changes that Grace and Lucy had brought into his life. He couldn't deny the warmth that filled the mansion now, a warmth he hadn't felt since his family fell apart years ago. His parents had passed away when he was young, leaving him and Clara to navigate the world on their own. Losing Clara had hardened him, driving him to focus solely on his career and shutting out anything that reminded him of what he had lost. But Grace and Lucy were different. They had broken through his carefully constructed walls with their quiet resilience and unassuming kindness. For the first time in years, Alexander felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that he could find meaning beyond his work. One evening, Grace and Alexander sat in the living room, watching Lucy play on the floor with her new teddy bear. The room was warm and cozy, the soft glow of the fireplace casting flickering shadows on the walls. She's so happy, Grace said, her voice filled with wonder. It's been so long since I've seen her like this. She deserves to be happy, Alexander replied, his tone gentle. And so do you. Grace looked at him, surprised by his words. I don't know if I know how to be happy anymore. You'll figure it out, Alexander said with quiet confidence. You're stronger than you think. Grace smiled faintly, her gaze shifting back to Lucy. You've been so kind to us, Alexander. I don't know how we'll ever repay you. You don't need to repay me, he said firmly. Helping you and Lucy, it's helped me too. Grace tilted her head, studying him. You don't seem like the type to need help. Everyone needs help sometimes, Alexander admitted. Even me. As the weeks went by, Alexander became more involved in Grace and Lucy's lives. He joined them for walks in the garden, helped Lucy take her first steps, and even learned how to make her favorite mashed bananas with Margaret's guidance. These small moments brought an unexpected joy that Alexander hadn't felt in years. Grace, too, began to open up. She told Alexander about her dreams of becoming a nurse, the struggles she faced after losing her parents, and the heartbreak of being abandoned by Lucy's father. Alexander listened without judgment, offering support and encouragement in a way that felt natural and genuine. One day, as they walked through the garden, Grace stopped suddenly and turned to Alexander. Why are you doing this? Doing what? He asked, genuinely puzzled. Helping us, she said, her voice tinged with curiosity and vulnerability. You don't owe us anything, and yet you've done so much. Alexander paused, searching for the right words. Because I can, he said simply, and because I want to. You and Lucy, you've reminded me that there's more to life than work and money. You've given me a reason to care again. Grace felt a lump form in her throat at his honesty. You've changed our lives, Alexander. I hope you know that. And you've changed mine, he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. That night, as Grace lay in bed, she reflected on how much her life had shifted in such a short time. She had entered Alexander's mansion as a desperate woman with nowhere else to turn, and now she felt a sense of hope she hadn't felt in years. Alexander's kindness, Lucy's laughter, and Margaret's unwavering support had created a haven where she could begin to heal. But with that hope came uncertainty. Grace knew she couldn't stay in Alexander's house forever. She needed to find a way to stand on her own 2 feet, to build a life for herself and Lucy that didn't rely on Alexander's generosity. The thought both excited and terrified her. The next morning, Grace approached Alexander with a determined expression. I want to find a job, she announced. Alexander looked up from his coffee, surprised but impressed by her resolve. You don't need to rush into anything, Grace. Take your time. I appreciate that, she said, but I need to do this. I want to provide for Lucy. I want to show her that I can take care of us. Alexander nodded, respecting her decision. What kind of work are you looking for? Something part-time to start, she said. Maybe in a clinic or a daycare. Something that will allow me to be there for Lucy too. I can help, Alexander offered. I have connections in the city. I can make a few calls. Grace hesitated, then nodded. Thank you, I'd appreciate that. Over the next few days, Alexander reached out to his network, and with his help, Grace secured an interview at a local pediatric clinic. She was nervous, but excited, and when she got the job, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The day she started work, Alexander drove her to the clinic himself. You're going to do great, he said as she stepped out of the car. Grace smiled, her nerves easing slightly at his encouragement. Thank you, Alexander, for everything. As she walked into the clinic, Alexander watched her go with a sense of pride. Grace's determination and resilience had inspired him in ways he hadn't expected, and he found himself looking forward to what the future held for both of them. The mansion felt quieter without Grace and Lucy during the day, but their absence only made Alexander realize how much they had come to mean to him. He began to imagine a future where they weren't just guests in his house, but a permanent part of his life, a family he never thought he'd have. As the days turned into weeks, Alexander found himself increasingly drawn to Grace. Her strength, her kindness, and her unwavering love for Lucy had captured his heart in a way he hadn't thought possible. But he kept these feelings to himself, unsure of how she felt in return. Unbeknownst to him, Grace was grappling with her own feelings. She had grown to trust and admire Alexander, and her gratitude for his kindness had deepened into something more. But she was hesitant to act on these emotions. fearing that it might jeopardize the bond they had built. The dynamics between Alexander and Grace began to shift subtly as they spent more time together. Their interactions were filled with warmth and understanding, but beneath the surface, unspoken feelings simmered. Both were acutely aware of the growing connection, yet neither dared to voice it, unsure of how it might change their fragile newfound equilibrium. One afternoon, while Lucy napped, Grace decided to tackle some chores. She insisted on helping Margaret, despite the housekeeper's protests that it wasn't necessary. Alexander walked into the kitchen to find Grace elbow-deep in soapy water, washing dishes with an easy rhythm. "You know we have a dishwasher," he teased, leaning against the counter. Grace glanced over her shoulder, grinning. "Old habits die hard. I like doing things the old-fashioned way." He chuckled, watching her. "You're full of surprises, Grace." She turned to face him, drying her hands with a towel. "Like what?" "Like how quickly you've turned this place into a home," Alexander said, his voice sincere. "It's been a long time since it felt this way." Grace's smile softened. "You did that, Alexander. You gave Lucy and me a chance when no one else would. And you've reminded me what it's like to have a family," he replied, his gaze lingering on her. The words hung in the air, their meaning unspoken but deeply felt. Grace felt her cheeks flush, and she quickly looked away, busying herself with arranging dishes. Alexander, sensing her hesitation, decided not to press further, though his heart ached with the weight of everything he wanted to say. That evening, Alexander found himself in his study, staring at a photo of his late sister, Clara. He often turned to her memory for guidance, and tonight was no different. "Clara," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You always said I'd find someone who'd make me feel whole again. Do you think it's her?" The photo offered no answer, but Alexander felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. Grace had brought something into his life that he hadn't realized he was missing, a sense of belonging, of hope. He resolved to find a way to express his feelings, but the timing had to be right. Meanwhile, Grace lay awake in her room, staring at the ceiling. Her mind replayed their earlier conversation, the way Alexander had looked at her, the depth in his voice. She couldn't deny the feelings that had taken root in her heart, but she feared misinterpreting his kindness. "He's just being thoughtful," she whispered to herself. "Don't read too much into it." But despite her attempts to convince herself otherwise, she couldn't ignore the way Alexander had become an integral part of her and Lucy's lives. She felt safe with him, cared for in a way she hadn't experienced in years. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. The following weekend, Alexander suggested a trip to the countryside. He wanted to give Grace and Lucy a break from the city and show them the beauty of the sprawling estate he owned just outside New York. Grace hesitated, feeling like she was intruding, but Alexander insisted. The drive to the estate was filled with laughter and light-hearted conversation. Lucy, strapped into her car seat, babbled excitedly about the trees and hills she saw through the window. Grace couldn't help but smile at her daughter's delight. When they arrived, Grace was awestruck by the estate's beauty. Rolling green hills stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted with wildflowers and a sparkling lake. A cozy cottage stood at the heart of the property, its stone walls and ivy-covered facade exuding charm. "This is incredible," Grace said, turning to Alexander. "I thought you'd like it," he replied, pleased by her reaction. "I used to come here with Clara. It was our escape from the chaos of the city." Grace's expression softened. "Thank you for sharing it with us." Alexander smiled, his gaze lingering on her for a moment, before he turned his attention to Lucy. "What do you think, Lucy? Want to explore?" Lucy clapped her hands, giggling. "Yes." The day was filled with simple joys. They walked along the lake, Lucy toddling between them as she held their hands. Grace marveled at the ease with which Alexander interacted with her daughter, his natural gentleness and patience. As the sun began to set, they returned to the cottage, where Margaret had prepared a picnic-style dinner on the patio. The golden light bathed everything in warmth, and for a moment, Grace allowed herself to believe that this could be her reality, a life filled with love and laughter. After dinner, Lucy fell asleep in Grace's arms, exhausted from the day's adventures. Alexander watched as Grace gently laid her daughter on a makeshift bed in the living room, tucking a blanket around her. "You're an amazing mother," Alexander said softly as Grace joined him on the patio. "Thank you," she replied, sitting beside him. "But I couldn't have done it without your help." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the sound of crickets filling the air. Finally, Alexander spoke, his voice hesitant but determined. "Grace, there's something I need to tell you." She turned to him, her heart racing. "What is it?" Alexander took a deep breath, gathering his courage. "You and Lucy, you've changed my life. I've been alone for so long, I didn't even realize how empty it was until you came along." Grace's breath hitched, her heart pounding in her chest. "Alexander, I know this might be sudden," he continued, his voice steady, "but I want you to know how much you both mean to me. I don't just want to help you. I want to be part of your lives, if you'll let me." Tears filled Grace's eyes as she looked at him, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his voice. She had spent so long trying to survive, she hadn't dared to dream of something like this. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Just say you'll think about it," Alexander said gently. "There's no rush. I just needed you to know." Grace nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Thank you, Alexander, for everything." They sat together under the stars, the unspoken possibilities of their future hanging in the air. Both knew that the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time they felt a sense of hope, a belief that they could face whatever came their way, together. The days following their countryside trip were marked by a shift in the atmosphere between Alexander and Grace. Their bond had grown stronger, and while the words Alexander had spoken under the stars lingered in Grace's heart, she still found herself grappling with the fear of hoping for too much. For Alexander, however, the clarity of his feelings only deepened. He found himself looking forward to every moment spent with Grace and Lucy, cherishing their presence in his home. It was no longer just a house. It felt alive, brimming with warmth and love he hadn't realized he craved. One morning, Grace awoke to the sound of laughter echoing from the garden. She glanced at the clock. It was early, too early for Lucy to be awake. Curious, she slipped on a cardigan and stepped outside. The sight before her brought an instant smile to her face. Lucy was toddling after a small ball, her laughter ringing out as Alexander gently rolled it toward her. He crouched to her level, his suit trousers slightly wrinkled from kneeling on the grass, yet he didn't seem to care. "Almost, Lucy," Alexander cheered as the little girl missed the ball, but clapped her hands in delight anyway. "You're going to be late for work," Grace said softly, crossing her arms as she leaned against the doorframe. Alexander turned, flashing her a boyish grin. "I've got a few minutes. Besides, this is much more important." Grace laughed, shaking her head. "She's got you wrapped around her little finger." "And I wouldn't have it any other way," he replied, his voice laced with affection. The sincerity in his words sent a flutter through Grace's chest. She watched as he scooped Lucy up, twirling her around and making her squeal with joy. For a moment, Grace allowed herself to imagine what it might be like if this were their life, if Alexander weren't just a kind benefactor, but a permanent part of their family. Later that day, while Lucy napped, Grace found herself wandering through the house. She ended up in the study, a place she hadn't ventured much. The room was lined with bookshelves, the rich scent of leather and wood filling the air. On the desk sat a framed photo of a young woman with a bright smile. "That's Clara." Alexander's voice came from behind her, startling her slightly. Grace turned to see him standing in the doorway, his expression soft. "Your sister?" He nodded, stepping into the room. "She was everything to me. After our parents passed, she practically raised me. Losing her it changed everything." Grace looked at the photo again, her heart aching for the pain he must have endured. "She seems lovely." "She was," Alexander said, a wistful smile tugging at his lips. "Clara had a way of making everyone feel special. She always believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself." Grace hesitated before asking, "Do you think she'd approve of us being here?" Alexander's gaze met hers, his eyes filled with emotion. "Grace, I think she would have loved you and Lucy. She always wanted me to have a family, to be happy, and for the first time in years, I feel like I might be getting there." Grace's breath caught at his words. She wanted to respond, to tell him how much his kindness and presence had meant to her, but the weight of her emotions made it difficult to find the right words. The following weekend, Alexander invited Grace and Lucy to attend a charity gala with him. It was an elegant affair held in a grand ballroom, and while Grace was initially hesitant, Alexander assured her that they would only stay for a short while. "You don't have to do anything but enjoy yourself," he said with a reassuring smile. Margaret helped Grace prepare, loaning her a stunning dress she had tucked away. When Grace emerged from her room, Alexander was momentarily speechless. She looked radiant, her simple elegance drawing the attention of everyone in the room. "You look incredible," Alexander managed to say, his voice filled with awe. Grace blushed, ducking her head. "Thank you." Lucy, who was staying behind with Margaret, waved enthusiastically as they left. "Bye, Mama. Bye, Alex." At the gala, Grace was nervous at first, surrounded by the opulence and sophistication of Alexander's world. But he stayed by her side, introducing her to a few close acquaintances and ensuring she felt comfortable. She was surprised by how easily he navigated the room, charming everyone with his charisma while remaining attentive to her. As the night went on, Grace began to relax. She found herself laughing at Alexander's anecdotes, enjoying the way his eyes lit up when he spoke about topics he was passionate about. For a moment, she allowed herself to forget the hardships that had brought her here, and simply basked in the joy of the present. On the drive home, the atmosphere in the car was quiet but warm. Lucy was already asleep by the time they arrived back at the mansion, and Margaret ushered her to bed. Alexander and Grace lingered in the living room, neither quite ready to end the night. "Thank you for inviting me," Grace said softly, sitting on the couch. "I didn't think I'd ever get to experience something like that." Alexander sat beside her, his gaze steady. "You deserve it, Grace. You deserve so much more than you've been given." She looked at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You've already given us more than I could have ever hoped for." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their emotions filling the space between them. Finally, Alexander reached out, his hand brushing hers. "Grace," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I meant what I said before. You and Lucy, you've changed everything for me. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I want you to be part of it." Tears spilled down Grace's cheeks as she smiled. "I don't know what the future holds either, but I think I'd like that." As the weeks went by, their bond only deepened. Alexander became a constant in Lucy's life, her laughter filling the mansion as she grew more comfortable with him. Grace found herself opening up in ways she hadn't before, sharing pieces of her past and dreams she had long buried. Alexander, for his part, began to envision a life he hadn't dared to dream of, a life where his house was filled with love and laughter, where Grace and Lucy were more than just guests, but a family he could call his own. And though neither of them said it out loud, they both knew they were on the brink of something extraordinary, something worth holding on to. The summer evening was serene, the garden bathed in the warm glow of lanterns strung across the trees. Alexander had insisted on a quiet dinner outside, wanting to savor the peaceful moments he'd grown to cherish. Grace and Lucy were already seated, the little girl giggling as she reached for a flower on the table. "Careful, Lucy," Grace said gently, adjusting her daughter's reach to avoid knocking over a glass. Alexander walked out carrying a plate of fruit, a rare sight given his usual delegation of tasks to the staff. "I thought we'd keep things simple tonight," he said, setting the plate down with a smile. "You mean you thought I'd enjoy a break from the kitchen?" Margaret teased from the doorway, earning a chuckle from Grace. They began eating, the conversation light and filled with laughter. Alexander found himself watching Grace as she spoke, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the lanterns. She was radiant, her warmth and kindness drawing him in more than he thought possible. After dinner, Lucy began to yawn, her energy finally waning. Margaret appeared at just the right moment to take her inside for bedtime. "Come on, little one," she said with a smile. "Let's get you tucked in." Lucy gave both Alexander and Grace a sleepy wave before disappearing into the house. The two adults sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the evening air filled with the soft chirping of crickets. "You've made this place feel alive again," Alexander said suddenly, his voice breaking the quiet. Grace turned to him, her expression curious. "What do you mean?" He leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the twinkling lights above. "Before you and Lucy came, this house was just empty. I didn't even realize how hollow it was until you filled it with your laughter, your warmth. You've changed everything, Grace." Her cheeks flushed and she looked down at her hands. "You've given us so much, Alexander. I don't know how we'll ever repay you." "You don't owe me anything," he said firmly, leaning forward. "If anything, I owe you. You've reminded me what it's like to feel human, to care about something beyond business and success." Grace's heart raced at his words, the sincerity in his tone leaving her breathless. "Alexander, He reached across the table, his hand gently covering hers. "Let me finish," he said softly. "I've spent so much of my life building walls, shutting people out because I was afraid of losing them. But with you, I don't want walls. I want to let you in." Tears welled in Grace's eyes, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "You mean that?" "More than anything," Alexander replied, his voice steady. "You and Lucy have become my family, Grace, and I want that to be official." The words hung in the air, their weight heavy with meaning. Grace stared at him, her mind racing with a mix of disbelief and hope. She had dreamed of this moment, but she had never allowed herself to believe it could actually happen. I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Say yes," Alexander said, a small smile playing on his lips. "Say you'll stay, not as guests, but as part of my life, forever." Grace wiped at her tears, her smile breaking through despite the emotions threatening to consume her. "Yes," she said, her voice firm. "Yes, Alexander, we'll stay." Relief washed over his face, and for the first time in years, Alexander felt whole. He stood, pulling Grace to her feet and wrapping her in a gentle embrace. They stayed like that for a long moment, the world around them fading away. Later that night, Grace found herself standing by Lucy's bed, watching her daughter sleep peacefully. Her heart was full, the weight of years of struggle finally lifting. She turned when she heard Alexander enter the room, his steps quiet as he joined her. "She's beautiful," he said, his voice low. "Just like her mother." Grace smiled, her cheeks flushing. "She's my everything. I hope you'll let me be part of that everything," Alexander said, slipping his hand into hers. "You already are," Grace replied, her voice soft but sure. "And you always will be." The days that followed were filled with joy and anticipation as Alexander and Grace began planning their future together. He made arrangements to officially adopt Lucy, ensuring that she would always be secure and cared for. The process was smooth, thanks to Alexander's influence and resources, and it wasn't long before Lucy was legally his daughter. On the day the adoption was finalized, Alexander surprised Grace with a small celebration at the mansion. Friends and staff gathered to mark the occasion, their cheers filling the air as Alexander lifted Lucy onto his shoulders. "You're stuck with me now," he teased, making the little girl giggle. Grace watched the scene with tears in her eyes, her heart full of gratitude. She couldn't believe how far they had come, how much their lives had changed since that rainy night when Alexander had stopped to help them. As the evening drew to a close, Alexander pulled Grace aside, his expression serious but full of love. "There's one more thing I want to ask you." "What is it?" Grace asked, her heart racing. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Opening it, he revealed a delicate ring that sparkled in the dim light. "Grace, will you marry me?" Her breath caught, and for a moment she was speechless. Then, with tears streaming down her face, she nodded. "Yes, Alexander, 1,000 times yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger before pulling her into a kiss, the cheers of their friends and family ringing out around them. It was a moment of pure joy, the culmination of a journey that had transformed them both. The mansion was no longer just a house. It was a home, filled with love, laughter, and the promise of a bright future. Together, Alexander, Grace, and Lucy began building a life that was everything they had ever dreamed of, proving that even in the darkest of times, kindness and love could light the way. The days after Grace accepted Alexander's proposal were filled with a flurry of preparations and excitement. The mansion buzzed with activity as staff and friends came together to help plan the wedding. But amidst the chaos, there was an overwhelming sense of joy and contentment that enveloped everyone involved. Alexander, who had once thrived in the predictability and structure of his meticulously planned life, now found himself relishing the unpredictability of a life filled with love and family. His mornings were no longer silent. Instead, they began with Lucy's laughter echoing through the halls and Grace's warm smile greeting him at breakfast. On a quiet morning a week before the wedding, Alexander sat in his study, flipping through old photo albums. Each image told a story of a life filled with accomplishments, but devoid of personal connections. He paused on a picture of himself as a younger man, standing outside a newly constructed corporate building. "It's strange," he said aloud, not realizing Grace had entered the room. "I look so proud in this photo, but I don't remember feeling anything at all." Grace placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You've changed, Alexander. You've allowed yourself to feel, to connect. That's worth more than any achievement in this album." He looked up at her, his expression softening. "And that's because of you and Lucy. You've taught me what it means to truly live." Grace smiled, her heart swelling with emotion. "And you've shown us what it means to feel safe and loved. We've all given each other a second chance." The wedding day arrived on a sunny afternoon. The mansion's garden transformed into a magical setting adorned with flowers and twinkling lights. Friends and loved ones gathered, their faces beaming with happiness as they took their seats under the canopy of trees. Lucy, wearing a light pink dress and a crown of daisies, took her role as the flower girl very seriously. She scattered petals along the aisle with a mix of precision and excitement, eliciting laughter from the guests. As Grace walked down the aisle, her arm linked with Margaret's, Alexander felt his breath catch. She was stunning, her simple white dress emphasizing her natural beauty. But it was her expression, a mix of love, determination, and joy, that truly captivated him. When they reached the altar, Margaret gave Grace's hand to Alexander, her own eyes glistening with tears. "Take care of them," she whispered, her voice full of emotion. "I will," Alexander promised, his voice steady. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, their vows reflecting the journey they had taken to get to this moment. "I was lost," Alexander began, his voice filled with sincerity, "until I found you and Lucy. You've given my life purpose and meaning, and I promise to spend every day showing you how much you mean to me." Grace's eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she replied, "You gave us hope when we had none, Alexander. You've shown me that love can heal even the deepest wounds. I vow to stand by your side, to support you, and to love you with all that I am." When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the crowd erupted into cheers, and Lucy ran forward to hug them both. "Does this mean we're a real family now?" she asked, her voice full of wonder. Alexander knelt down to her level, his arms encircling her and Grace. "We've always been a family, Lucy. Today just makes it official." The reception was a celebration of love, laughter, and new beginnings. Guests danced under the stars, the sound of music and merriment filling the air. Margaret watched from the sidelines, a content smile on her face as she saw the family she had grown to love so deeply finally find their happiness. Later that night, as the festivities wound down and the guests began to leave, Alexander and Grace stood in the garden, their fingers intertwined. The stars above seemed to shine brighter, as if celebrating their union. "What do you think the future holds for us?" Grace asked, leaning her head against Alexander's shoulder. "Whatever it is," he replied, his voice full of certainty, "we'll face it together, as a family." The days that followed were a testament to their commitment to building a life filled with love and purpose. Alexander continued to expand his philanthropic efforts, inspired by Grace's passion for helping others. Together they started a foundation dedicated to supporting homeless families, providing them with resources and opportunities to rebuild their lives. Lucy thrived in the warmth of her new family, her laughter and curiosity bringing endless joy to the mansion. Alexander and Grace made sure she grew up knowing she was cherished and capable of achieving anything she set her mind to. Years later, on a quiet evening, Alexander sat on the porch, watching the sunset with Grace and Lucy. The once empty house was now filled with memories, its walls echoing with the sounds of a life well lived. As Lucy ran off to chase fireflies, Alexander turned to Grace, his expression soft. "Do you remember that rainy night?" Grace nodded, her smile tinged with nostalgia. "How could I forget? It was the night everything changed." "It was the night I found you," Alexander said, his voice full of emotion. "And I'll be forever grateful that I did." Grace reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining. "And we'll always be grateful for you, Alexander. You gave us more than a home. You gave us a family." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the three of them sat together, their hearts full of love and gratitude. It was a moment of pure contentment, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope for a brighter tomorrow, for a brighter tomorrow, for a brighter tomorrow.